In 1817, Thomas Jefferson requested a simple carpenter's pricing book. He was refused. A former president, author of the Declaration of Independence, told no. That's where this story begins. In 1817, Thomas Jefferson, former president of the United States, author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the most consequential men in American history, requested a copy of a book, not a rare European manuscript, not a scientific treatise, a pricing guide, a rule book used by carpenters in Philadelphia. He was turned away. The Carpenters Company of Philadelphia, established in 1724, told the former president that their rule book was for members only. It held the formulas they used to price every phase of construction, the same formulas behind Independence Hall, Christ Church, Carpenters Hall itself. Thomas Jefferson, a man who personally designed his home at Monticello, who understood architecture better than most trained professionals of his time, was denied access to this document. I spent weeks trying to understand why. What I uncovered had nothing to do with carpentry. It pointed to an entire economic system that existed before 1863, a system that didn't need banks, a system they needed us to forget. I came to this research through a piece of furniture. My grandmother left me an oak chair, dense and solid, built sometime in the 1840s. Nearly 2 centuries later, it still sits perfectly level, no wobble, no creak. I started trying to trace who made it. Instead of a name, I found a system. The craftsmen who built furniture like that chair didn't work the way we assume workers have always worked. They weren't paid by the hour. They weren't borrowing money to purchase materials. They were part of something called the guild system. And once I understood how it functioned, I understood why it had to be dismantled. The Carpenters Company of Philadelphia is the oldest surviving craft guild in North America, 300 years and still operating. Their members weren't carpenters in the modern sense. The 18th century called them master builders, people who combined what we now divide between architects, engineers, and contractors. When Philadelphia needed Independence Hall, they built it. When the colonies needed a gathering space for the First Continental Congress, they offered Carpenters Hall, which their own members had constructed beginning in 1770. Those buildings still stand today, not as museum pieces kept alive by constant repair, but as functional structures. Their rule book, the one Jefferson couldn't access, contains something official histories tend to gloss over: a pricing system built around what they called unit pricing. Every stage of construction carried a standardized fair price, not whatever the market would tolerate, not whatever a client could be persuaded to pay. A fair price, determined by experienced members called measurers who always worked in pairs, specifically so no single person could inflate costs for personal benefit. The system was designed to protect both the craftsman and the client. Credit lines between community members could stay open for months, sometimes years. Work was exchanged for food, for services, for raw materials. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, in a 1928 report on wage history, described colonial America this way: a system of barter existed throughout the first century of settlement, and the very scarce currency was little used in the payment of wages. Face-to-face arrangements helped bind communities together. The obvious counter-argument is that this was primitive, inefficient, thousands of local currencies, barter economies, guild monopolies. Official history tells us that by 1863, the system had become unmanageable. More than 7,000 different state banknotes circulating simultaneously. A $5 bill from New York worth less the moment you crossed into New Jersey. Counterfeit currency everywhere. And that part is accurate. The Library of Congress documents upwards of 10,000 unique, legal banknotes in circulation, not counting forgeries. But here is what I keep returning to. The buildings constructed under the old system still stand. The furniture still holds together. The communities, bound by face-to-face obligation, produced structures we haven't come close to replicating. When exactly did chaos become the only alternative to centralization? When did we stop asking whether something else might have worked? February 25, 1863. President Abraham Lincoln signs the National Currency Act into law. It passes the Senate by a margin of 23 to 21. 2 votes. The act creates the office of the Comptroller of the Currency and establishes the first national banking system. We're taught this was about stability, about replacing chaos with uniform currency. But the stated purpose, written plainly into the legislation and confirmed by the Federal Reserve's own historical archives, was to finance the Civil War by generating demand for federal government debt. National banks were required to purchase Treasury securities equal to 1/3 of their capital. In return, they received banknotes worth 90% of the bond's value. To issue more money, banks had to buy more government bonds. The entire architecture was built to create buyers for federal debt. A 2% tax on state banknotes followed in 1864. By 1865, a 10% tax had effectively wiped out state currencies altogether. This is where the pattern starts to take shape. The Homestead Act was signed 9 months before the National Banking Act, on May 20, 1862. It offered 160 acres of public land to any adult citizen for a modest filing fee of $18. Free land, the great democratic promise. Except, historians estimate that actually developing a homestead cost between $1,000 and $2,500 once you accounted for tools, seed, livestock, and building materials. As the National Archives states plainly, comparatively few laborers and farmers could afford to build a farm or acquire the necessary equipment. Most of the land went to speculators, cattlemen, miners, lumbermen, and railroads. Only 40% of claims were ever successfully completed. The Homestead Act gave Americans free land they couldn't afford to use. The National Banking Act, 9 months later, built the system that would lend them the money. That's not coincidence, that's architecture. What replaced the guild system tells us something uncomfortable: the company town. Lowell, Massachusetts, founded in 1822, was the prototype. By the 1880s, roughly 2,000 company towns existed across America. Workers were paid not in currency, but in scrip, a substitute that could only be spent at company-owned stores. The Social Welfare History Project documents what followed. Without outside competition, housing and groceries in company towns became exploitative, and workers accumulated debts they were legally required to settle before leaving. 75% of all scrip issued in America came from coal companies in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. Workers couldn't leave because they owed more than they made. The Pullman Strike of 1894 pulled in over 150,000 workers across 27 states. A federal commission formed to investigate it called George Pullman's model un-American. But by then, the company town had already replaced something: the guild networks that enforced fair pricing, the barter systems that tied communities through shared obligation, the extended credit between neighbors who knew each other by name. All of it gone, replaced by scrip you could only spend at the company store. I pause sometimes and ask myself whether I'm constructing connections that don't exist. Maybe the timing is coincidental. Maybe the Homestead Act and the National Banking Act arrived together simply because Lincoln's government was handling multiple crises at once. Maybe company towns emerged because industrial production needed concentrated labor, not because older systems were deliberately cleared away. But then I look at who still lives by the old principles: the Amish. They still operate a contribution-based economy. When someone faces a medical bill they cannot cover, they stand up during their weekly church gathering and explain the situation. No one leaves until enough has been raised. It functions like insurance, but inside the community, with no outside institution collecting a profit.
And here is what unsettles me. They had to fight for this. The Amish clashed with the federal government for years over Social Security, which they understood not as a tax, but as commercial insurance, something their faith prohibits. Congress granted them an exemption in 1965. To preserve a system that worked without banks for over a century, they had to petition for legal permission. They still file IRS Form 4029, Application for Exemption from Social Security and Medicare taxes and waiver of benefits. They pay all other taxes. They simply refuse to participate in the replacement system. The fact that they had to fight for it proves the old system was made illegal. The fact that they still function proves it worked. There is another pattern I cannot dismiss. Genealogists call it the 1870 brick wall. The 1870 census was the first to record all Americans by name, including formerly enslaved people. Before that year, tracing most family lines becomes exponentially harder. The 1890 census, which would have filled in the most critical missing gaps, was destroyed. A fire in 1896 damaged special schedules. A larger fire in January 21 in the Commerce Department building destroyed most of what remained. The damaged records sat untouched for 12 years. Then, in 1933, Congress authorized their destruction. One day before that authorization, President Hoover laid the cornerstone for the fireproof National Archives building. The timing feels almost staged. The same decade that reshaped American economics also reshaped American identity. Before 1870, you belonged to a community, a guild, a local web of mutual obligation. After 1870, you were an individual listed in a federal census, earning wages, borrowing from banks, your family history traceable only as far back as the government's records allowed. What if guild systems weren't primitive? What if they were simply alternative? What if the furniture that endures 2 centuries and the buildings that stand for 300 years aren't accidents, but evidence of something that genuinely worked? The Carpenters Company rulebook wasn't protected because it had commercial value. It was protected because it contained proof that fairness could be systematized, that communities could regulate themselves, that you didn't need a financial institution inserted between every transaction. What if debt wasn't evolution? What if it was replacement? The Homestead Act offered free land that required borrowed money to develop. The National Banking Act created the lenders. The company towns created the borrowers who could never walk away. The census created the documentation, each piece interlocking, each piece arriving in the same decade. I keep coming back to that chair in my grandmother's house, nearly 200 years old, still perfectly level, made by someone who was probably compensated in provisions, who probably learned their craft through a 7-year apprenticeship, who probably never once signed a loan application. And I keep thinking about all the furniture manufactured today, engineered to fail in 5 years, built by workers paid wages they cannot survive on, purchased on credit cards carrying interest rates that the old usury laws would have made criminal. Progress, we call it. But the chair still stands, and the questions remain. Why do buildings constructed under the guild system endure for centuries, while structures built with bank financing require constant upkeep? Why was the Carpenters' rulebook so carefully guarded that even Thomas Jefferson was turned away? Why did the government wait 12 years after a fire to destroy the 1890 census, choosing to do so one day before breaking ground on a fireproof archive? Why do the Amish need a congressional exemption to maintain a system that ran without interruption for 150 years? Why does every American family tree hit the same wall in the 1870s? The same decade the banking system consolidated, the same decade the census became comprehensive, the same decade company towns spread across the country. I don't have answers, only patterns.
and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it.